So today what we'll be doing is a fall leaf project. So this is a reference of different fall leaves I have. You could actually do this technique with any leaves because we're going to be doing some negative painting. So at the end our project's going to look a little bit like this. Basically we're going to be painting the background of our leaves first and then the background that's around the leaves afterwards, to kind of work on painting the negative of the watercolor rather than literally trying to paint our subject and paint the background. So for this first, what I'm going to do is I've already sketched out a couple leaves, and basically what you want to have is an odd numbers of leaves are typically better, just because in composition, numbers of 3 and 5 look better compositionally, and also it makes it look more random. So this example, I have 5 leaves on here, and when we do our leaves, we want to make sure that we have them, facing different directions. You don't want to have them all exactly the same or in a row, because then that doesn't really look very natural. Because, even though this is man-made, we want it to look very freeing and loosey-goosey. So, and you want to have a nice collection of different leaves. If you want, you could always just repeat the same leaf over and over again. And I would recommend drawing your leaves on a scrap piece of paper and then transferring them in whatever area you want to. So when you're drawing leaves, one big thing to look at is leaves typically are symmetrical. So I want to try and look at how the middle line is kind of my guide for my leaf. So if I was drawing that kind of leaf, I would draw the middle line, and I could even draw like maybe the tip kind of shape, this kind of shape, just to make sure I have, everything kind of sketched out. Looks kind of like a bird. So, and then from there, I would start off drawing one side at a time, and you really have to look at your negative shapes when you're doing this. So not necessarily the outline of your object, but the area in between your objects, especially with leaves. And here, it's really important because you don't want to have a leaf where it's like, oh, look how big this is, because that will not match the other side. So that's generally how I would draw a leaf. Obviously, if it's a more simple leaf, like one like this, I would just draw like an oval and then add some ridges and points to that. And once you're happy with your drawing, then I would transfer it onto your paper. A great way to transfer watercolor papers is actually to scribble 6B pencil on the back of your drawing and then to trace your drawing onto the other side, because that's going to push down that graphite onto your watercolor paper without hurting it as much. There's also carbon paper or graphite paper you can use, but that tends to be really dark, so that's why I typically recommend putting 6B pencil on the back of your drawing. Sorry. So I already have my leaves sketched out right now. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to start by prepping my fall leaf colors. So you could also do this technique with, if you wanted to do spring leaves and have them all green, or if you wanted to have blue leaves for some reason. I mean, blue leaves are cool. But for this project, we're going to be doing fall leaves. So I'm going to be doing a lot of yellows, oranges, reds, browns, and I even threw in some green in there and things like that. So since with this technique, we're going to be using a wet on wet method, I want to make sure I have some nice puddles of color prepped on my palette. So I'm going to be taking a large round brush, and I'm going to get a nice amount of water on my palette. And then I'm going to be taking some cadmium yellow. So a good color to use for fall leaves if you want it really, really bright is cadmium yellow light or lemon yellow. So basically just a school bus yellow is really good. And as we get into the oranges, then I could use like a cadmium yellow medium, which is a little bit warmer. It almost looks like orange. And for these puddles of color, I want them very saturated. So when you want colors to be saturated, you want to make sure that you're grabbing a good amount of pigment and not a lot of water. Because sometimes when we feel like we're running out of colors, we add a ton of water onto our palettes, and then we end up running out. So, and then my palette, I have tube colors I've just squirted onto my palette. These aren't fresh, so I'm having to add a lot of water to grab as much pigment as I want on here. So you could also work from fresh tubes if you want a lot of saturation. You just have to be careful that you don't make it too thick, or else then you won't, make it look like watercolor. So I have my cadmium yellow mixed, and then I'm going to make an orange, which I can make with cadmium yellow and a little bit of cadmium red. Since cadmium red is a dominant color, it's going to take over my yellow very quickly. So that's why I just want to use a very small amount. See, it's already a reddish orange. And then I'll add some more yellow. There, that's very pretty. I'm going to add some red because I want a nice puddle of red. Move this over so y'all can see my puddles a little bit. So I have those three, and then I'm also going to prep some Tuscan red, which is a really pretty color. See, it's kind of a brownish red. It's really, really pretty. But of course, if you don't have like a Tuscan red, you could always use a burnt sienna or burnt umber, just for some different colors to have with your leaves. So now that I have those all nice and prepped, next what I'm going to do is start painting my fall leaves. So when I'm painting my fall leaves, I'm going to start by wetting my paper first. And when I'm doing this, you want to try and make sure that you have, a little bit of clean water in your water bucket. So I have a water bucket that has 2 sections, but it's not super important for this project to have clean water, just because all of our leaves are going to end up colored anyway. But if you were trying to keep your colors all even and not get mixed, then you would want to do clean water. So I'm going to take some of that clean water and I'm going to put some section by section over my sheet of watercolor paper. So I'm not painting the whole entire picture with water first, because one, that's just going to waste water because I won't be able to paint the whole section while the water is wet. So I want to make sure I'm just painting a very small section at a time, but I'm also painting this section a little bit larger than I'm going to paint. And the reason for that is so that when I start putting my paint in here, then I'm not going to have any harsh edges or hard edges, and it'll help me to lead into the next section. So when you're wetting your paper, you want to make sure there's a little bit of a sheen like that, but you don't have a really big puddle on top of your paper, because a lot of times if you have a really big puddle, that means you have too much water. So, and then while this is wet, I'm going to go ahead and start grabbing my yellow, and you can just drop in the color like that, or you can kind of use the side of the tip and work your color in that way. But with this project, you don't want to like overdo it and over touch your paper, because we want to have room for the colors to kind of meet each other and blossom. So that's why I'm not really moving around the colors very much. I'm kind of just touching them, leaving them on here. So we want to focus most of our colors inside the outline of our leaf, but we don't want to leave the outside of the leaves blank, just because once we start adding our background color and our salt, some of those colors are going to show through, which are really pretty, but we don't want to waste a ton of color here and lose out on putting color inside our leaf. So that's what I mean by focusing on putting the colors inside your leaf. And I could always throw in some red on the tips. And you don't have to look exactly at your reference picture to choose what colors you want to do. This could all just be whatever colors you feel like using. But reference pictures are always a great reference and something to have as you're working. So notice how now my edge over here is nice and soft. Some areas are getting a little hard. So if I notice that ahead of time, I could just put some water next to it to kind of fade it out. And now I'm going to work on my next section. Doing the same thing with water. Oops, I'm running out of yellow, so I'm going to grab a little more of that. Dropping in some yellow. some Tuscan red. Maybe a little orange also. And then my next section, I'm going to add a lot of water. Of course, I could always have divided this into two. And let's say this one, I'm going to make a little weird, and I'm going to do some orange and also some green. Because some fall leaves, you do see a little bit of green in them. Like this one's slowly changing from green to yellow. I'm using some sap green just in some small areas. There you go. So, and then as my colors are drying, you may notice that maybe the colors are losing their color and getting a little too light. So if I'm noticing that, I can always come in with some more paint and I can just drop it right in. But when I'm dropping in my colors, I'm doing it very gently because you don't want to push too hard, or else sometimes it makes an indentation on your watercolor paper. And then I'm going to go ahead and let this one dry off to the side, and then we're going to talk about our next step. So obviously I already had this one painted and it's nice and dry. So with your painting, you want to make sure that you have time to let it dry. You could always practice on a separate piece of paper and then work on it at a larger size, or you could always blow dry your paper. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to start prepping my background colors. So for our background, you want to think about, our leaves have a lot of yellows, they have a lot of oranges, and we want to think about colors that are going to help to make those colors pop as well as to tone them down. So a lot of times if you use complementary colors, which are colors that are across each other from the color wheel, or just, these are warm colors, you could use cool colors, then purple or blue would be a good choice. So for this painting, I used a little bit of purple, which was a quinacridone magenta, but you can always just use any purple you have. And then I also used some blue in some areas. But if you want, you could always just use purple everywhere or go with whatever color you feel like. You can even do gray, Payne's gray. Those are always good as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start prepping my background colors. So for my background color, I'm going to use some purples, which let's see, on my palette, I do not have a literal purple. So I'm going to be making a purple with alizarin crimson and some ultramarine blue. So I'm going to take some of that alizarin crimson, but rose madder is also a good pinky color to make purples, because if you use like a cadmium red, it's going to make kind of a brownish purple since it's more of a warm red. I'm going to add a little blue. Let's see, where's that ultramarine blue? Or cobalt blue would also be a good choice. So, and then here's my purple. So I'm going to go ahead and, just like last time, we're going to wet our paper. So, but when I'm wetting my paper this time, I want to make sure I'm wetting around my leaves. So for this, you could switch to a slightly smaller brush, or as long as your big brush has a nice tip, you should be fine. And I'm going to be wetting in a small section. And you can go right up to your leaf, or you could leave a little bit of a gap. And what's great about this project is if you mess up and go too far on your leaf, that's okay, because leaves get eaten by caterpillars or have holes in them all the time. And you can also make leaves doing this. You wouldn't necessarily have to draw them ahead of time. You could just paint in where you wanted your leaves. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab some quinacridone magenta. And when I'm dropping in these colors, I really want to focus a lot of the color right next to the leaf, because that's going to make a nice outline for my leaf. and I'm kind of pulling it out because I don't want my color to puddle up right next to the leaf. So I'm kind of pulling it outwards into the water. And when I'm going around my leaf, I'm trying not to leave an outline. So I'm kind of doing a thicker shape rather than just a line. Because a lot of times with lines in watercolor, they tend not to fade as easy. And especially for backgrounds, you don't really want any lines. So when I'm pulling out this color, I wet my paper a little bit farther, so that's why it's kind of fading on the edges. And I could always take in some extra water and fade it out like that. And then I think I'll also drop in just a little bit of Payne's Gray for fun. So and a great way to get some extra texture in your background, like you could leave this just as it is. I'm going to be adding in some margarita salt. So it doesn't have to be margarita salt. It can be just table salt. I like margarita salt since it's nice and chunky. So I have a little bit in my hand. I'm going to sprinkle into the wet section. So you have to make sure that it's wet, because if it's not wet, then the salt's just going to sit there and not do anything. So it is very important that the paper is wet. So, and then next, right now, okay, this area is nice and soft most of the time, and this section is getting a little hard. So what I want to do now is take a little water and fade it a little bit. But what's great about this technique for the background is the salt kind of covers up any mistakes or harsh edges, just because it creates a lot of texture. I'm going to add a little salt, because salt kind of sucks up the pigment of watercolor, so then you don't have to worry about any mistakes underneath. So then I would continue doing this for the rest of my background. And of course, you can always change colors as you go along, making sure that your colors are nice and dark right near your leaf, because that'll make it pop up. And you can always do another coat on your background later once it's dry. But at this stage, you know, when it's really, really wet, you don't want to overwork your paper. So you want to make sure you let it dry and then come back. All right, so, and then I would go ahead and continue this technique for your whole entire paper. And then basically, once you've done doing your background, it's going to look like this. So where you have all, you know, the salt is going to suck up that pigment. So the more salt you use, the more it's going to suck it up. So if you don't want a lot of texture, you want it more like this, just use less salt. So next, what I want to show you is how you can make some veins on your leaves rather than drawing them in pencil. So on this one, you can see I painted in this leaf, this vein, but you can also use a lifting technique like this to lift up a vein. So like I'm going to come in with a slightly flat brush. It's a little fuzzy. This technique best works with a nice firm brush, and typically, you know, acrylic brushes are really great firm brushes, and I like flats. And my brush is slightly wet, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lift off a little bit of that paint, almost like scrubbing. And this really works well with a nice skinny brush, because sometimes if your line gets too big, you know, then it doesn't look as skinny as a leaf. And you can go back and forth as many times as you want. It's good to wipe off your paintbrush kind of in between if it seems like it's not lifting as much anymore. And then I could always come back in and add a little shadow on the other side of my vein, just to make it pop out a little bit. Or you could just leave it as lifted up. So, and you can also just use like a little brown to paint in your stem and other veins. It's always a lot of fun. And then the other thing I can do to my leaves, which I think is really fun, is doing a water drop. So water drops are really fun to do on leaves. You can do them on flowers, all sorts of things. And a big important part about doing water drops is they're essentially just like spheres. So you have a couple different components that are very important for it to look realistic. And that's having a cast shadow, a highlight, a reflected light, and then kind of a core shadow. So those are the main parts of a drop. So what I like to do first is use a pencil. You can also just paint your drops onto the paper. You don't necessarily have to draw with pencil all the time. I like to. And you want to make sure you don't put your drops in areas that are very dark or very light. You want a nice medium, because it's a little bit harder to try and make up all those different values if you're in a very high contrast area. So I'm going to go ahead and just draw a drop shape. So that could be a perfect circle. You could do an oval. You could even have a dripping drop. That's totally fine. And what I'm going to do is take a small brush like this. And first I'm going to be putting in the shadow. So on this leaf, there's a little bit of like orange, kind of Tuscany red color. So I'm going to use a little bit of my Tuscan red watered down, and I'm going to go underneath my drop like this, kind of underlining it, but you want it more like a shape than a line. And I'm going to fade it out with a little bit of water. Like that. And then I'm also going to do the same on the inside of my leaf. So this is more of like an upwards curve, and then now I'm going to do a downwards curve inside the drop. So just right inside, like that. And then again, I want to take a little bit of clean water. If you think you have too much water all the time on your paintbrush, you may want to have a sponge next to you or a paper towel to tap it off on. And I'm going to drag that down so it fades. So we're going to have to let this fade a little bit before I can add the really bright highlight. But I'm going to go ahead and add my reflected light. And this is just with some white gouache, but you could always use white acrylic, or, once it was completely dry, you could use a white paint pen. And I'm taking a little bit of that gouache and I'm going to put it underneath the shadow, still inside the drop though. And I'm going to fade it a little bit because you want your reflected light to be a little bit lighter, a little bit duller, than your brightest highlight. So I'm going to attempt now to put in my other highlight, maybe a little too wet, but we will see. And it could just be a little swoosh. And there you go. That's how you do a water drop. So I'll show y'all once more. I'm going to take some yellow now. Since this is in the yellow section, I want to make a little darker yellow. And I'm going to go underneath the drop like this as a shadow. I'm going to fade it with a little bit of water. And then inside the drop, I'm creating a shadow inside and fading it. And then I'm going to take a little bit of gouache for the reflected light. And again, I have to fade it. Lots of fading today. And then a nice bright highlight up in the corner on the dot. So, and it could also just be a dot. You don't have to do a swoosh every single time. Sometimes it can just be, a little dot on one side, depending on where your dot is. So, and that's basically how to make a nice fun fall negative painting with some leaves. You can apply these techniques on any other type of leaves or even flowers.